kind of repairs a relation with the Slade. We used to do far more stuff together, and I think many of us hope that we will be doing that in the future. So this event over 2 days is also, I think, a kind of sign and an intention that we should know more about each other's work. This morning there are going to be presentations by Bruce Maclean, by Barry Martin, by Pascal Schoening, and by
John Aiken.
No, not
John Porritt?
Not the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. And then this afternoon there will be briefer presentations. Okay, well, it's a great pleasure then at the AA for us to welcome Bruce Maclean to start this off. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, but I think Barry and I would like to say a couple of things before we proceed. Barry, do you want to start?
Just to introduce the source of why we came together today for these 2 days of activities. Bruce and I, who have known each other for 30 years, probably share some beliefs in a polymath approach to the arts in terms of sculpture, painting, space, architecture. And in recent times there's been a debate that certainly we've had about the nature of some activities within our fine art ethos that seem to have been undeclared, unexplored, and was probably rather influential in different ways, certainly in terms of an expanding understanding of space and reality. Bruce?
Oh, yeah. I totally agree. No, I just also thought that because of a lot of kind of interest in art and architecture, which I actually hate the term, that perhaps you should put the thing straight. I think there is architecture, basically, and art comes under it somewhere. But it just seemed to me that I work in various places, and there's lots of people in various places doing similar kinds of things, or seemingly similar kinds of things, and it seemed to be an opportunity, an excuse to get everyone together, to mess it up a bit, to see what we can make some more friends and make some more connections. And basically, if that happens, that'll be fantastic. First of all, we're here, and then we're going to be there, and then we might be here again. So I'm going to show... Shall I start?
Yes.
Well, I sort of finished already. I'm going to... Bye-bye. I'm going to start by showing a couple of projects from the 60s and the 70s. I'm not going into the 80s because I actually packed up once or twice. I packed up art in 1969 because I was sort of depressed about the way it was going, and I started up again a little later. I'm about to pack it up again. Well, actually, it's packed me up, in fact. So what I'll do is show you what I've been doing very quickly and as concisely as possible. Most people will probably, who are here will probably maybe aware of what I've been doing. I'm a sculptor and trained as a sculptor at St. Martin's, as Barry did as well. And it was an interesting time when I was there because we were encouraged to question the nature of sculpture. That's probably why Richard Long took a walk. But that's what we were encouraged to do, to inquire into the nature of contemporary sculpture. No drawing from the nude model was allowed. In fact, it was actively banned. When I was there, I don't know what happened when you were there. Did you do any, Barry?
I'd already done a lot already.
Oh, I'd done a lot already, but we was banned when we were there. Anyway, so my basic work from then on has been an inquiry into sculpture. Not the nature of it, but sculpture. So I'd like to start by showing you a few slides. Yes, sorry?
Just say one word. The organisation of the day would be, as Mark has introduced it, there's 4 presentations or deliveries this morning. At the end of each, if people would like to ask some short questions, and there may be some short answers, great. This afternoon, the Rijksacademie presentations will take place with Peter Strijken, Christian Zwanigan,
Lisa May Post, and Pim Komen.
Following that, at 4 o'clock or thereabouts, we would like to open up a debate with all the speakers of the day and everybody in the audience, so we can actually have a question and answer interaction activity taking place. So there will be a chance for a major debate at 4 o'clock this afternoon on
Yeah.
everything that's taking place.
That is good, and we should also say that tomorrow at the Slade School of Art up the road in Gareth Street, a lot of architects are talking, and I think that'll be very good, particularly for the Slade, and I hope that the architects are here who should come to the Slade and find out what's happening up there. Okay? So I shall proceed very swiftly with some slides. Can I move around with this? Is that as dark as it gets? Well, this is an early sculpture. I got very quickly fed up with it, with the lump, with the object. It got rather quickly into behaviour, and I made an exhibition of myself in a space called Situations. It wasn't called a gallery; it was called Situations, which meant you could actually do more or less what you wanted. And this is a piece called "There's a Sculpture on My Shoulder." It started off with a chip and ended up there's a lot of sawdust, and it lasted quite some time. This work. But it was not. It was only a proposition for what sculpture might be, and not art. This is another work which was took place the next day in the same space. It was a 2-hour pose work for plinths. It was an attempt to question the idea of the plinth, which had been abandoned by Anthony Carra, who thought that the plinth sculpture should go on the floor. But as the sculpture department of St Martin's was on the 9th floor, it seemed a rather odd thing to be dealing with. And so the fact that the sculpture went from the plinth on the 9th floor to the floor then suggested the possibility of actually putting it in the basement. Then we had to look at the water level, and then we got under sea and into the... That's how it went. So it was... I hope you're keeping up with this speed of delivery, but that's actually basically what happened. And that, this is what that's about. But I returned briefly to the plinth, because the plinth was abandoned very quickly, but I returned very briefly as a sort of homage to Henry Moore. This is another view of the same work, and another view of another work. This is a work for a specific situation called People Who Make Art in Greenhouses piece. And I positioned myself and this work in a greenhouse. Because of this business of the plinth to the floor, to the seabed, to the centre of the earth problem, it seemed that we could put sculpture anywhere, and it actually has been a kind of problem for me, an inquiry as to where you actually position things. And that's what I've been sort of trying to deal with. So I've been moving around trying to deal with things. This is another piece for a plinth. This is an action which culminated in a photographic work. This work is actually a photographic work. It's a Dutch photographer called Dirk de Volder took this photograph over a period of 3 days. I kept jumping off this wall and trying to fall onto a plinth. And this is one where he caught me falling onto the plinth. This is another work from the 60s of a series of photographic pieces positioned on plinths. This show was part of the same show. The show changed all the time. People came to see the show one day. I was in the middle of changing it. It changed all the time. Unlike shows which seem to continue for the duration of 4 weeks. I could never understand why everything's the same. There's an interesting gallerist in Turin, or Milan, I think it's Turin, called Gianenzo Speroni, who put an exhibition on, and when Hans de Boom arrived, he bought it and he closed it. If he didn't come for 6 years, he kept it open for 6 years, they came and bought the work, then he closed it. It seems to be a reasonable thing to do. This is another piece, installation for a skirting board and sofa. This is what one call a kinetic piece, because kinetic art was something which was around in the 60s and became a thing we didn't talk about for a long time. Like conceptual art was around for a while, but that also became a thing you didn't talk about, because it moved into environmental art and spawned a few environmental courses in this country in the late 60s, which were closed down because you didn't talk about that either. For some peculiar reason. This is a 2-part mineral floating sculpture for Barnes Pond. This is a still from a videotape called Waiter, Waiter, There's a Sculpture in My Soup. This is a piece for Ferre de Hollander. It's a 3-part photo mirror work. I spent a lot of time walking about the urban landscape with a mirror. Because I did a lot of works with running sculptures and moving sculptures, things which attempted to kind of make possibilities for what sculpture could be, but I got asked a lot of difficult questions like, why don't you paint something realistic, or why don't you do something which we can understand? So I thought, well, I get a mirror, and it looks like a sort of a very beautiful painting, so everyone was very happy. That's what spawned this work. Here's a running sculpture. Here's a sculpture of me taking a line for a walk, which is a homage to Paul Clay. Oh, and that's the end of that. Here we go. This is another version of this. I think it's very important to make 3 versions of everything. One for your personal collection, one for the tax, and one for the bank. I got that wrong. Here's another. There's 3 versions of that line. It's a different piece of string each time, and a different location. Here's another walking piece coming from another angle. And here's an early ice work. I started to make things which, with ice and things which weren't permanent. I was kind of interested in the idea that things were not permanent, but there were propositions and things about changing. I wasn't interested in the idea that an object would be positioned in a place and remain in a fairly static situation. I wasn't involved with kinetic art, but I was aware of what was going on from people like Barry, who I showed with, and other people in the 60s, and they although I wasn't making the same kind of thing, it was relating to that, I think. But this is a splash piece. It's a brick being flung into a brook. It's a brick and brook work. And here's two mud puddles, mud piles in our same brook piece. Now, I'm perfectly serious about this. They were propositions, and I think they were quite early on, these propositions, which got me included in what was called conceptual art shows: land art, body art, process art, male art, female art, all that sort of stuff. And that's what prompted me to leave the art world. Everything you did was immediately categorized and called something, when all I was attempting to do was actually find a place for the activity I was dealing with. Here's a floating piece. And this is a removal piece. This was a retrospective at the Tate, 1972, when I prepared this piece in '69, but it took me 3 years to get it into the Tate. It had to be in a proper place. You normally have retrospectives at the Tate in this country, and I had to have a retrospective, which meant that it means you're dead. It means, you know, that's you. So I made a book. The book was the catalogue of the show, and the catalogue was the show. People came in and bought the catalogue, and the show was removed. The idea was that the whole thing would be removed, but it was a rather wet March day, and I think they might have removed about 1,000 catalogues. I still have a couple of these catalogues left, by the way, but later on. I'm just going through this very quickly. I think I've just shown this moving stuff because this is where I'm sort of coming from, and I'm actually now, I'm not going to show what I'm doing now, I'm actually working in a film, which is a series of moving images. But I was kind of very obsessed with the behavior around things and the behavior around art. So I formed a pose band, which is a non-verbal communicatory band, which relied on gesture and movement to communicate ideas of domestic unrest or whatever. This was a piece called, I forgot the name of this piece. It's called Deep Freeze. It was a sound work for 5 deep freezes. With a few political gestures in the background to try to make another connection, but nobody picked up on this, of course. This is from the remake of a piece I did in 1974. I also have to say that I'm very concerned and interested in collaboration, and the idea of working as a group interests me rather than working as an artist and with the one kind of the kind of one-person star effect. So I worked as a group. We had this group called Night Style, the world's first pose band, and we were quite successful up until 1974 when we disbanded, owing to an ideological disagreement. This is a piece called High Up on a Baroque Palazzo. Now this actual piece was to do with sort of to do with doors and entrances and exits. And because of this piece, there's a sort of exit and entrance thing happening. Because of this piece, I was invited to do a talk here in about 1975 by Bernard Schumann, because he was quite interested in this. And a lot of architects at the time were quite interested in this kind of activity. I am the son of an architect, I wasn't allowed to be one for obvious reasons, too fat, too small, and not look smooth enough. But the idea was to make some work. This was an influential work, I think. There's a seminal work list. You're looking at a seminal work here. I think, look at that entrance, look at that, look. I need to look at that, look at that. You see, then people criticize me, say I just rip off Don Judd when I make a minimal sculpture, but what's more minimal than that, apart from the design of the shoe here? But anyway, this was a very influential work. Everything moved, doors opened, the floor went up and down, people went up and down, and pulleys, people moved around in space. It lasted for an hour and a half. It was kind of constantly moving all the time. And it was to do with a badly designed 4-foot 3-inch high Baroque palazzo. Basically, the piece was about making an entrance and positioning a swimming pool cum sofa on this actual balcony. Here is an a BA student at Mason in the middle of one of his, getting his Studio General, who made a performance called Semi-Domestic. This is an early training shot where we were rehearsing at UCL gym, training for that big one, the big pose. Here's us training in Hyde Park. This went down very well with foreign visitors who used to appear at 10:30 every Sunday morning for coachloads to take photographs, and we fulfilled some sort of function. This is the remake in Holland at the Maclean Theatre. Yes, there you can see the Lansing and Bagnall forklift truck positioning the sofa cum swimming pool with a 4-foot 3-inch high Baroque palazzo designed by a team of Italian architects. This is another view of that piece. It wasn't actually theatre, and it wasn't dance, and it wasn't sculpture, it was pose. And within that new context of pose, we could behave any way we liked, and we could redevelop the term and the whole concept. This is another work called Seen from the Side, a collaboration with two people. The audience was sitting at the side, seeing how it went on at the back, and we played it to the front, so actually it was sort of like this. Not the greatest idea. This was an idea based on a photograph that I saw in a performance magazine based on a photograph from the nice style Baroque palazzo. It's an American theatre man called Richard Foreman and borrowed it. So I borrowed it back. This is another seminal piece called In Terms of an Institutional Farce Sculpture. It's a 50-foot corridor with 9 doors. Let's just say, it wasn't successful in Hyde Park. It was more successful in Germany. This is a 3-part dancing piece around a hat with a lump of cheese, and this here is a photograph from a major piece called The Masterwork, the award-winning Fish Knife, a piece about architectural photography and the use of photography in architecture. This actual whole structure was made of huge 30-foot by 30-foot photographs, which are moved in and out. This was a collaboration between Paul Richards, myself, Michael Nyman, Ed Keinholz, Neely Christo, his wife wouldn't let him, and dancers, acrobats, gymnasts, stunt people, and so on. I wanted to bring everyone together into the one work, and to make a work of total mediocrity. And in fact, it was so mediocre, it was dull. And in The Guardian they said, this work isn't bad, it's a killer. And consequently the place was packed out because people like to see a disaster in this country, so it was a very successful review. So never say something's good. And this is another photograph we repositioned. And here's the old forklift truck again, moving up and down, the same old idea, things moving up and down. Basically this piece was a criticism of architecture and design processes, done in a slightly humorous way, but it didn't come across because we used mediocre people with a mediocre script to make something which was absolutely mediocre. And you know, it was a rather stupid idea. You could use talented people with bright ideas to do it, but unfortunately it didn't quite work like that. It was a disaster of the first order. It cost me and the Arts Council enormous amounts of money. And that's why I'm here today. And I'll be happy to pick up a check when I'm here. Here's another view of this piece. This is quite an interesting piece on the forklift truck. It's a cubic foot of earth from the National Foundation of the National Gallery in Berlin, designed by Mies van der Rohe. It's a piece that Ed Keinholz, one of the 4 cubic foot of earth that Ed Keinholz sent us from 4 of the worst museums he thought in the world. Why he sent them to us, I haven't the faintest idea. I think it's something to do with the foundation for this new work we were doing. But each time he sent a box of his earth, it cost us £400 in customs clearance at the airport. So we only managed to get 2 in, and there's still 2 down there somewhere, full of worms and maggots. Which is just another living work, which is continuing somewhere down in a storage at Heathrow Airport. And this is, and very quickly, one other piece. I'm mainly showing you kind of action pieces, because basically what I'm actually about is actually kind of things which don't last. I'm interested in this, not that. This is a slide of that. It's uninteresting. And a lot of the things I've done, I've never photographed, never documented, because it's uninteresting. It's just, as you'd have, no, you missed it, sorry. That's a good one, that one. That's an early sound piece. And this is a piece called Another Bad Turnout. It's based on the trouser width of Charlie Satch's trousers, which are over there, hanging on this thing. I think it's also quite important to eradicate yourself and extract yourself from situations. When you get drawn into situations because you behave badly, then you have to extract yourself all the time, otherwise you get continually dragged into it. It's quite important to keep moving like a wild animal covering in tracks. So I'm trying to do that all the time. This is a work I built with another artist called David Ward and Angus McCubbin. This is in Riverside Studios. This is us rehearsing it. We painted it blue. It looked better in the kind of slightly plywood finish. It's called Good Manners and Physical Violence. It was a kind of dance piece for a box. Heavily influenced by the works of Oscar Schlemmer. Oops, sorry about that. No, let's go back to that. No, oh yeah, this was a piece called Possibly a Nude by a Coal Bunker. It was a piece, I made a piece where everything went wrong. When you make performance pieces, everything never goes right. This is actually quite well, it's one of the slides of it. But normally everything goes wrong, so I actually made everything go wrong. Everything fell down. She wouldn't take her clothes off, you know, the coal bucket, you know, everything got ripped, the photographs were taken incorrectly, but in fact it sort of worked because it couldn't get any worse. Yeah. This is a piece called Partition, based on the 8x4 panels we seem to have in art schools, which seem to modify and control our lives. 8x4 and metric timber. Another view of that. I think that's the end of the slides. Yeah, good. Right. Do you have any questions now? But basically what I am is a sculptor, and I'm actually concerned with sculpture and working with architecture and space, and I actually work a lot with architects, collaborating with them from the inside out rather than the outside in. I'm concerned about tables, chairs, floors, and drilling holes in the centre of the earth, wind, temperature, sky, sun, light, environment, all these things. And I'm going to run off now. Okay, thank you very much.
Hello, is that working with the microphone? Can you go back? Speak up a bit. Is that recording okay? Yeah? No? Testing this tonight today? No, yeah. Yeah, but I think particularly want to go on and off. Yeah. I don't know the slide. Somebody else will go over
You
that.
can tell him.
Okay.
You just say next. Sorry. You just say next. My hands are really hard. You don't want to get them.
Hello, my name is Barry Martin, and as Bruce said, we first had a connection in 1965, 66, and we showed at the ICA together. The work I'm going to show you is starting as a student at Goldsmiths College in 1960-61. And unlike Bruce's presentation just now, which is a very difficult act to follow, I'm showing how I came to develop moving works, or how movement in itself became an integral part of my process of, in a way, testing reality. And I tended to work towards the idea of setting up, if you like, a laboratory type situation in which I carried out visual perceptual tests. So some of the work I made was a result of this rather contained situation, and then it became shown in exhibitions during the 60s and early 70s. And if I've got time, there are some slides of some more recent works. One I did on the Hogarth roundabout in the early 80s. I also have an interest in chess. This is the way chess pieces move, and there's a piece I showed at the Tate Gallery in '91, which is based on a Plato chess set in movement, which caused Jeannie Duchamp and her daughter to be rather surprised. So the point of Duchamp stuff was kind of an accolade, I thought. So I'm going to go through this, beginning with some light drawings in the early 60s. So quickly have the first slide, please. I'm a firm believer in drawing, and I still draw, and I still teach drawing at the moment at the RCA, and drawing from natural objects, objectively trying to look at the reality of the space outside myself and drawing that information in, was very important to me then, is now. Out of drawing and the perceptual experience, philosophy, perceptual psychology, and reality testing had already become part of my formative process thinking activities in the early 60s. Could we go on next, please? So there's simple studies, still lives, nudes on beds, view of Spain in 1960. Next, please. Skull heads. The work on the right, you can't see very well. The nature of the mark, the structuring of marks performed in 1961 started to become interesting and important to me. Next, please. Quentin Crisp on the left. Next. Drawings of machines started to play a part in 1962, and on the left is a fan, and on the right part of the magneto car engine assemblance. These are quite big drawings, but also a sense of movement starts to come into these. Next. More car some parts. Could you do the right projector, please? That one. That's it. In looking at the model, space, I started to try and structure composition in a two-dimensional way, and also became very involved in the optical nature of colour. Became very interested in Seurat and colour thinking and looking, and that proved to be a rather important development for me, because the optical nature of perception led me into the psychology of perception, and we can look at that as it goes on. These are about 2 feet high. Can we go on? No. And structure composition in a two-dimensional way, and also became very involved in the optical nature of colour. Became very interested in Seurat and colour thinking and looking, and that proved to be a rather important development for me, because the optical nature of perception led me into the psychology of perception, and we can look at that as it goes on. These are about 2 feet high. Can we go on? No. Next. So the structure of mark making to the surface and how one perceives it became extremely important, and I started to analyse the unit that one may use to make an image. There are other paintings taking place, such as this on the left. This is all at Goldston, is where I trained to begin with as a painter, or as a painter in study. On the right, those little units from the Seurat figurative-based painting, in terms of the nature of the way our eye may perceive the structure, developed into those works, which are 1964-65. The top left, middle, and top right. The top right painting is about 4'6" high, and were first shown in the Northern Young Contemporaries in 1965. Okay, next. On the left, this nature of structuring is part of the same exhibition on the left here in 65. The unit or rhythm of moving across a surface in a structured way was very much part of that. And there's a cell here. Which was an analysis in 1965 of a Mondrian painting shown in the Piggy Guggenheim exhibition in London. And this was a Mondrian painting of composition of red, where I stood in front of it for about 4 weeks, trying to analyse the way the movements in the picture plane operated as I stood in front of it and perceived it. And I wrote a dissertation on that, which was published as a little monograph on that one painting. So movement and eye movement across the surface started to be a structural process for me. Can we go on next on the slide? On the right, some of these started to move into a relief form. I'll come to that in a moment. But on the left, the idea of the unit having an interrelationship with its neighbour through juxtaposition. I wanted to break away partly from this more rigid, if you like, mathematical-based structuring and try to go to free-form movements. And the picture on the left is 5 foot square, is on board, and the little units, which also represented male and female units, were originally cut out of card, little bits of card which I painted, and I pinned them to this board, so there was a kind of collage physical beginning to it. Having got them juxtaposed how I wanted them, I then carefully drew around them all, and then spent 2 weeks painting them in. The thing was that when you look at it, you get free-form structures appearing and dissolving. So there was a kind of perceptual series of rhythms that take place that form in front of your eyes, then break down in front of your eyes. And I hope some of that's taking place as you're looking at it now. On the right, some of these moved into these releases. Go to the next slide. On the left was a piece that's shown in the Young Contemporaries. And here, these were balls, the white things were balls. And there was a kind of reverse perspective involved in it. They were also mounted on watch springs, and I had a distance from the surface. And so they actually could move physically, but what you had was a kind of focusing, a reverse perspective back to the spectator. So wherever you were in the space in front of it, there was a kind of centering, a focusing of these units towards you. So it had an environmental positioning activity in terms of the space. On the right was a structural painting where I started to break into colour. Go ahead next one. On the left is an early mid-60s piece where I started to open up in a mechanical way, a structuring of how the movements might go. These bars at the front were reflective surfaces that could kind of push in and out, but I wanted the whole structure to be visible. On the right is a slightly earlier piece where I started to look into the mechanics of how movement could be necessitated. In the painting department at Goldsmith at that time, this is 65, arguments were going on about even purchasing a 35mm camera for the use of the department. Just to let you know how, at that stage, you had great difficulties. Purist painters wanted nothing to do with cameras. Other people were saying cameras were needed because postgrad students or students trying to postgrad courses needed to photograph their work. So it was bought as a purely functional object. But I was actually going from the painting department to working in the engineering department at Goldsmith. And the engineers welcomed me with open arms, said how nice to get an input over here from what's basically a fine art mentality. Painters were horrified. I was actually moving into an engineering department and doing something which they could not understand. This was at Goldsmiths way beyond Thompson and Michael Craig Martin and any of that, the breakdown, if you like, of the notion of boundaries. Go to the next piece. Light as a source from those early paintings we were just looking at subclear, extremely important role. And this is a reflective piece on the left and a movement piece on the right. We have the next one. This was a piece that was shown in the first piece which showed geodesic dome he made. And that structure, and you can see going up there are units for this geodesic dome. It partly came about because Peter Pictures has been asked to look towards making cheap housing to the Middle East for areas of deprived housing facility. But in fact, it was also first constructed and shown in this exhibition, and I had the very first exhibition in it. I constructed this very large, these are 1,000-watt theatre lights suspended beneath this hung platform, and they were red, green, and blue. And they were programmed in such a way that they could move and oscillate, so the whole of the environment, in terms of the surface of the dome, had a series of programmed light structures. So these lights moved up and down, turned, stopped. So one could be in this kind of colour structured environment. They were programmed by a series of computer controllers, but my ability of electronics was quite poor. As I came from a fine art background, and this was all totally new activities. We got the next one.
Can I ask you a question? When was that exhibition?
Well, that
was in the car.
That was 68.
68, yeah.
That was actually, but the light structures were actually made prior.
Yeah.
This on the left is a part of the colour filter activity within the dome, but on the right are some of the colour experiments I did with students in 68, where we looked at the colour and form and light. That's back at Goldsmiths. I was employed back at Goldsmiths despite all my sins of going to the engineering department. And Andrew Ford employed me for several days a week. Okay, next. So this is looking at the way colour and form could interact, and how the turning of surfaces may influence the way the colour structure can work. Next, please. And next. On the right was another light structure. Those moving lights, nobody had done them before, and it was patented, which is an interesting phenomenon for me because describing reality again, how through a patent it's an invention described. The patent was made and the principle was taken up. I probably could be a millionaire now if I took out some of the against all people who use movement like that, which was like everywhere in the world. So I also would not be able to believe this probably as well. Like
The check's not on the phone, so
no, could we go on, please, mate? On the right is this kind of laboratory workshop idea. I had a place in Earl's Court in Cromwell Road, first floor place, drilling, banging, neighbours banging on the walls, using electric drills and all sorts of things. Next. Next. On the right was a series of programmed shapes. I was very interested in movement in the sense that you could only perceive the nature of the object after a period of time. And here are a series of shaped programs that moved and altered their shape. Therefore, the object could only be perceived in a series of activities through time. So the process of time and what took place in it could only be given in your understanding of what this object, or something that went outside of its object nature to. Could I put this on here? That's a piece that I made in the end. That's one down on back to front, sorry. But that's a piece that's about 4'6". It's on the move. It's about 4'6" high. It's made of steel. I made it in '65. It's in terms of the process of becoming, these had 81 very big rods. Those things are half-inch diameter, 18 inches long, to give you an idea of the size. They move terribly slowly in and out this structure. It was a deconstruction piece in '65. Did it before Mr. Derrida. I got to it. So some of us are kind of hot on the trail already, as Bruce was talking about. Highly influential in ways. Right, after that. The Arts Council in that piece. They showed it once and have it locked in the Hayward. Can we carry on, please? Next. Another piece, that same piece on the left is what you just saw on the right. The piece on the right doesn't look it, but those arms coming off are about 6 feet long, and there were 3 types of shape on the end. And each arm could move, and a couple of them bent with the weight of the object on the end. No, they interacted. Shapes pushed against shapes, so you had a kind of series of different movements taking place. Next. This was a piece I showed at the Royal Academy, and on the left you can see part of it. It's about 28 feet across and about 14 feet high. This is about 1969, I think it was, and it had a series of 3 stainless steel plates which were 4'6" square, and they flapped. They actually moved in and out on their edges, and this one on this side rotated. Behind them was a series of coloured flaps. Can we have the next one, please? Was a series of colours behind some of these. So as these flaps came out, they reflected the environment and opened it up. But also you saw different proportions of colour structure behind as they were exposed or not exposed. To get the flaps to move, just to let you know something about the engineering side of this, I didn't know how to do it, but in fact I was flying to Holland in late '67, '68, and looking out the window, I saw the elevator, the flaps going up and down, and I asked the flight engineer afterwards what caused that, and he said there are actuators which push and pull. So when I got back, troops shot me in Tottenham Court Road, and I went up there and got my actuators. There they were. It's like discovering gold. So this thing made a great roar with these actuators that make enormous noise when they're going, as they're pushing and pulling. Next. This is another piece, not the tubular bit there, which was a Bill Pye and the Bridget Riley's, forget those. It's that linear bit right on the right, and this bit here, which was about 12 feet high. That arm, this big arm here, moved and rotated. And there was a ballet school to the right of this exhibition, and they were all lifting their legs. So this big arm was lifting its leg at the same time. So there's something quite interesting about that. Next. Here you see that piece again. On the right, could you do the left-hand projector, please? This is a piece of OSCA. There's a suspended rod that used photoelectric beams, and I think you can just see the two electric beams there. I had a pair of them. This arm rotated and moved. This is 1971. Rotated and moved and stopped and oscillated. Its relationship to the photoelectric beams triggered what was on the left here, just down that corner, a bank of 14 projected lights. And according to its position in space, it projected light back onto this wall. You can just see a colour structure of the rod back onto the wall. So you had a kind of interactive space, location, colour, form thing. Also, these photoelectric beams, which were very new around 71, could be interrupted by lots of people coming in. So you had another involvement. Next. Can you keep going? There's a onwards, please. What next?
Was that a group show or was it just one off?
No, it's a group show. Next. You can see this arm oscillating, stopping and moving, doing all this sort of thing. Next. On the left is a piece I showed at the Hayward Gallery in the Big Kinetic exhibition in 1970. Next. Your head moved was about that high, so this was an environmental piece that you could walk in and around. Part of this explosion into space came from the St. Martin's bit that Bruce was talking about, where the idea of identifying space was important. Next. Next. On the tops of these things were these constructed forms which are based on radials, and above them were these little ellipses that allowed colour translucency to come through. Next. On the right was a drawing predating the particular piece. On the left was a performance piece of St. Martin's I did with Gerard Hemsworth in late 1966, which involved all the students on the sculpture course, and I was very interested in sensory deprivation, as I was talking about sensory psychology, and had the American astronauts training manuals about sensory deprivation, and thought of setting up this environment where none of the participants could ever see the environment. In fact, the environment was made, they were led into another room not knowing what they were going to go into, and reluctantly but obligingly took all their clothes off and put these special hoods on. They were then led blindfold into this big environment where they then explored it in a tactile way with various kinds of music being played. The music was shunting trains and strange mechanical sounds. Richard Long, George Passmore, some of those people were part of those people coming in. They all led out. At each end there was a 60mm film camera crew working, filming the whole thing in two directions. They were led away, all the participants. The following week they were reassembled, and for the first time they actually saw, because we showed the 60mm film side by side on the split screen, exactly what had taken place. So we were very interested in the delivery as to what they thought they'd been doing, as opposed to how they could now see themselves doing it. The little incident here was that just there you could see there was, as part of the environment we had a rather nice female model who was prepared to stand there. Unfortunately one of the participants got carried away and grappled her so heavily that this man called Peter Aiken, who Bruce knew very well, had to rush in and pry the guy off her.
Very well.
Very well. Next, please.
Change his name.
This is a piece on the Hogarth roundabout. I wanted to take a very real space in London, in Chiswick in '82, and Chiswick roundabout has all this light and dynamic around it, and I wanted to try and do something with it at night with traffic, so this is part of the photographic documentation of that. Next. Keep going on these, please. Keep going. Part of that late 60s bit I just want to come back to because I also made very large freestanding sculptures using coloured planes. The piece on the left, is late 66, 67. I put this great slab above one's head, and without being too modest, it was quite influential on Slade School of King's Holy Cara, who made Deep North, or whatever, the next year. Nobody put that weight idea up above, especially with these kind of coloured planes that held that. Next. These are other pieces stacking colour on colour in terms of spatial divide. Next.
Well, these are us at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. That's why they saw them. The piece on the left, Tony Carr was very interested in the next year produced Prairie, which was influenced by this piece here. Next. You can see the piece on the right. Next. Tracks were important. Well, like Bruce was talking about. Rhythms in the snow on the left was something I took on board. Next. To show ahead of the Serpentine Gallery, the first show there was a series of structure pieces and different types of movement taking place through and across. Next. Part of the Serpentine installation on that still. Next. This is a piece I showed at the Tate Gallery in '91. It's a chess piece based on potatoes. King Edward. a royal game.
King Kongs.
A royal game. Can we just keep going, please? Both together. So this is the development of the potatoes. Big potatoes against little potatoes. The symbol sign interaction was interesting to me, where you get these stackings of the different signs according to the way it's done. I showed this in Belgium in the Beaux Arts Gallery 2 years ago with other artists of the past who actually worked on chess pieces, and I was in a very good company with Duchamp, Landry, Max Ernst, about 15 artists. So I think I did when he was still alive, but I might not be. Keep going. Keep going. Just keep going with me, please. That's it. I did it. Keep going. And the last perhaps couple of recent pieces on the right is a small piece I made in steel. I was very taken with the Somalia problem 2 years ago and made this piece in relationship to where my studio is, which is the gatehouse in Chiswick House grounds, which I restored, and Theo Copley, who alas passed away just recently, did in fact do the architectural plans for it. But I was very concerned about my position in the world in relationship to calamities and disasters, and I felt very inept and incapable of doing anything about it, given all the news that we get in of these disasters. So I made this little piece, which took me about 3 months. It's made out of steel and hand-painted with oil. And Sainsbury's is about 800 meters northeast of my studio, and Somalia is 4,000 miles southeast from my studio. And there are little directions on this ground plan about where my studio is. So this was meant to be, it packs up and goes into a little travelling case. And the two little bits in the middle, I think, are probably self-explanatory. Much food, Sainsbury's, very close, much human suffering, 4,000 miles away, and I'm in the middle of it somewhere as an artist. And what do I do about it? Because it was something I felt I had to do. And on the left is a large piece that sits just outside my studio door at Chiswick House grounds. And there we are, I think that's the end. I've run out of time. Okay. Thank you very much.
Considerably, well, slightly younger than Bruce and Barry, as far as I came into the art school again in the 60s and missed that explosion of, explosion of many things that I came into Slade School of Art when I was and my head of department there was a man called George Poulard, with a very egalitarian thought about what was going on at the departments. He was equally opposed to conceptualism and formalism, and his idea of both was that he'd like to quote, take a machine gun and shoot both sides of the departments. So we were left in this rather strange situation of having to find some space in between, and never really having any particular access to what was going on with the departments. I came from a relatively boring Belfast in the 60s, which was deprived of just about everything that was interesting, and everything interesting seemed to be going on elsewhere. I was trying desperately over the last few days to think of some influence I had during the 60s in relation to kinetic art or action, and only came up with two. One was an exhibition on kinetic art that happened about 1966, I think. And I went to a lecture by a chap called David Madala, who was a sort of character involved in the kinetic art movement. He showed several pieces. He gave a lecture, several of which made a connection at the time and subsequently come back. One was his own piece, which was kind of performance. Well, he was a performance artist himself. He made this thing called Cloud Canyons, which was a machine that spewed out silk. He also gave a lecture about a piece by Cusi, which was Cusi's Bird in Flight, a highly polished bronze piece. And he articulated this piece by the fact that the reflection made the Bird in Flight. The form itself was relatively simple, very minimalist, but the reflections created the sensation of movement. He amplified this by being in constant motion himself. Then I went through Chelsea. I did a number of works which were architecturally related, and then in 1973 went to Rome to do a Rome scholarship in sculpture. Will also just finished in Rome, and Robert Adam started at the same time as me, so there was this great dichotomy, neither of whom exercised any influence whatsoever at that time on me, but there was a neoclassical approach on one side and a modernist approach on the other. And one of the things that struck me about Rome in particular was that it was a very lavishly overlaid society. It was very decadent, and I had an extremely decadent time. For 2 years I didn't know what to do except, relatively speaking, enjoy myself. At the end of that time I did an installation piece which was a kind of rites of passage. It was moving from that environment in Rome back into another situation which was fairly unknown. But within a few months became moving back to Belfast to teach full time. So if we can show the first bit of the video, it's about 3 seconds long. I then switch to the slides. Well, is there something wrong with that? You have to stop now. I'll have to go on to the slide. Well, let's have the slide. We'll work through the slides and then maybe go on to that later. This is some photographs of a site in Agrigento in Sicily that I visited, and it's set up for an archaeological dig. The British School had a series of residence artists, but it also had a lot of architects, archaeologists and historians there. And we had the opportunity to visit various sites. This one was unusual insofar as it was an attempt by the archaeologists to get through a Roman city into a Greek city, so they sort of cleared the site of most of the Roman remains, but had left the olive trees, which presumably belonged to somebody, and then dug up this grid system. And one of the things that I found interesting about Rome was the sense of decay and rebuilding. One structure being, since Roman times, superimposed one another. One person decided to destroy what went before in order that he could assert his authority. And I made a piece which was over a period of 2 weeks. It was the last 2 weeks I was in Rome. Next slide, please. And it was about a process of construction and then destruction. The first week was constructing this grid out of soft sand and glass sheets. The glass sheets were set into the screen of sand, and then sand pressed in between them. And it was 7 of these were done each day, so there was 7 holes in a sense made over a period of 7 days, 49 holes in all. The exhibition was open to the public at this time, so it was a performance piece in one sense, but it was actually, I didn't relate it to performance at all. It was very much to do with me just working quietly through this cleared studio, which was actually my living accommodation as well. It had been turned from a living situation to an exhibition party. Next, please. At the end of the first week, I was left with this structure. It was 3 meters square, and each one of these holes was 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters by 10. And I started to remove the glass sheets in a spiral, so it started at one corner, working round, and eventually ended up at the middle one. And part of the reason for using sand was as a metaphor for time passing and decay. One of the things which I noticed in various aspects of Rome was as things got stripped off, things collapsed. So when the glass became a metaphor for the marble facings on buildings, and as that was removed, the buildings began to crumble, and this sort of rubble walls began to take over from this pristine formalism. Next. At the end of the second week, when I got all the glass sheets out, the exhibition ended, and I had to go back to just clearing up the studio to leave. And I just let this piece become part of the studio floor, so it began to get obliterated as I walked across from each access, to and from the staircase and the sink, and to and from the door and the sofa. Next. Until the whole thing actually just became another screen of sand on the floor. I then went from a relatively sublime situation to the ridiculous of moving from this decadence of Rome back into Belfast in 1975, when Belfast was a particularly unpleasant time. I was very unhappy when moved to Belfast anyway, and it had got considerably worse than 5 years I was away, 8 years I was away. The building on the right is one of the casements of the Maginot Line in eastern France. And shortly after arriving in Belfast, I was given a research grant to go to France and photograph the Maginot Line on the eastern borders and the Atlantic Wall on the north coast of France. Next. And I made a piece of work in the studio in Belfast, which was to do with coming to terms with being back in the city. It wasn't open to the public, it wasn't an exhibition, but it was set up exclusively for a camera. And I wanted to make some sense of not only the piece I did in Rome, but also the situation I found myself in Belfast. It was about a process, again, of construction and destruction. It was about a random pattern falling within a regular grid. And the regular grid was set up in relation to the viewfinder of the camera. So there was this internal rectangle which was 3 meters by 2, and an external one which was 5 meters by 4. And I started to build these 2-meter bars of sand, again pressed between glass sheets which were then removed, so the shuttering was removed, and it was section was 100 millimeters square. And the plan was to introduce these bars of sand in a relatively ad hoc way and replace this 2-dimensional rectangle with a 3-dimensional rectangle at the end. and go through a process of chaos back to an organisation. I don't know whether we could just run very, well, I'll run through these and then we do that and open the video again. The only premise as to where these went was where there was some space and where I could put a new one without knocking down an old one with my feet. So when it reached saturation point, it was at the point where I couldn't make any more without physically destroying the ones before. Next, these, and next. And that was about 30 bars of sand. The photo documentation of this, when it's put along the wall, you can trace through the history of some of these bars, some of which become virtually obliterated towards the end of the 30, others are very fresh and pristine. At the end of this period, which again was about a fortnight, I trimmed off the excess and trimmed it out of frame, so it became this rather chaotic three-dimensional image in the middle. And it was a symbol for me, not only of the sort of urban renewal which was going on in Belfast, but the sort of the conscious urban renewal, but also the urban renewal which was going on because of the situation. An awful lot of buildings were destroyed, particularly around the art school. An awful lot of that was going on as well. Could we run the video? We'll have to make do with this. That's the Rome piece. This is Belfast with several bombs blowing up around the art school. And this is this piece in 1977. Stop, right. And back to the slides. That gives some indication of the level of equipment we have at the Slade. What? The structures that I photographed in France in 76 and 77, the one on the right is a searchlight platform in Brittany, and it was a piece which became like this very formal structure on this beach, with no evidence of any destruction. Other works around the coast are almost completely destroyed, and I was doing an exhibition for a certain time in 78, and these photographs were in preparation for that. Next slide, please. The one on the left is a very huge structure near Cherbourg, highly organized in terms of its design and finished very carefully. The one on the right is on a beach in Normandy, done very much in an ad hoc way. It's added on to it. It's very on design. Next. Again, the one on the left is a place called Lons-le-Mer. And one of the things interesting about this was the fact that these holes are actually an attempt to camouflage the whole thing, where they'd attached screwed up cement pipes or something similar to the inside of the shuttering, and then they would stick plants, I presume, in here. They weren't evidence of fire. The one on the right, on the other hand, is a 300mm steel, thick steel cupola in Saint-Malo, and it was hit by a North American armor-piercing shells. Next, please. Similarly, this little lookout tower at Saint-Savon has been hit by armor-piercing shells. Again, this is an unusual structure insofar as you stand inside it, and it's exactly shoulder and head size, surrounded by 300 millimeters of steel plate. And it's a very odd situation to be in something so immensely heavy and still, but you have to look out through the slits and see a lot of movement and light, and also reflect this particular moment in time where an action has happened, it's frozen because of the nature of the material and the strength of the material and the high quality of the material. Similarly, on the right is where a shell has hit a gun emplacement and the shrapnel has come through the metal shield. These things acted as a kind of symbol for a lot of the things which I felt about Belfast at the time. It was something that one didn't engage with particularly because it was a city which in the mid-70s was essentially on the curfew. At 6 o'clock everything finished and we went home and you heard things going on, but were very rarely aware of them. Next, please. And these are two smaller bunkers on the beach in France, and I wanted to work out a system for the serpentine piece, which was a very simple series of constructing something over a period of time, and then a very controlled deconstruction of it. So I decided to use the progressive system that these gun embrasures use, which was a closing down of the space. Next. Other way, I think, this one. And this was the Serpentine Gallery in 1978. And I closed off the big gallery and had two entrances. The two internal entrances and not the external one. And there was two cameras set up at each one of these entrances. And then if we could, next please. It was on a 1 meter module. So it was 1 meter as tibius on up till 9. Next. And back down to 1. The exhibition opened with a piece like this and some photo documentation of its construction. And then I began to rack around the 3 remaining walls some pieces of timber which were 2 meters by 1. Next. And each day I threw one of these pieces of timber on at a relatively prescribed time and replaced photographed what the timber had done and then replaced it the next day with the 2 photographs. So you see on the right. One of the things about sand is it reflects time very accurately and it reflects attempts to interfere with it. So it's very fragile, but it's also very enduring. And particularly this London soft sand, it sets virtually like concrete once it dries out. So these pieces of timber actually started bouncing around rather than totally destroying the piece. Next. And next. And next. At the end of the 3-week period, I threw all the timber on again. Next. And then threw it on yet again. So I wanted to try and destroy it as much as I could, but rather like back to the Rome experience, no matter how many times you tried to destroy something, there was still a vestige of particularly in this case, the orientation of the lines. Next. No, sorry, can you just run the next little bit of the video first? These videos weren't actually animations of the actual piece, they're just animations of the documentation of the pieces. Well, I didn't do that on my own one. Right, slides again. And there's another one on the coast of France next. The one on the right, there's another little video clip of that, so I'm not talking about that at the moment. We have the next one on the right. And this is a piece from 1980 at the ICA in London. And it was an exhibition which was called Without the Walls, and it was an exhibition of Irish art. And like most group exhibitions, and most group exhibitions were at the ICA, it's a very awkward space. It's a space which is very difficult to maintain your own area in. And I decided to use the notion of without the walls, to actually build some walls and make a definition of the sort of space I was occupying. And so I took a module of 4 meters by 4 meters square, and then determined the north, south, east, west axis. These were, again, walls of sand 20 centimeters high, 4 meters long, and then set the perimeter 4 meters by 4 meters, and then divided it up into square meters. So the next on the left, please. Next one. One of the things which occurs when you do these things, it was being done in real time, so over the course of the exhibition I put the bars in. And I sort of expected things to be knocked about a bit more than they were. The only bit which actually ended up being destroyed was this corner, which was the only bit that the invigilators couldn't see on a regular basis, and people would go by, give it a little kick and see whether anything happened. But I remade the piece at my studio and wanted to totally obliterate each section as I went through to the next one. So I ended up with one remaining section. Next. And these are 2 images, one on the right taken in France and one on the left taken in China. And shortly, I went to China in the late 80s, and I bought this slide of one section of the Great Wall of China. And in a certain sense, it shows the kind of relationship that I wanted to happen with that ICA piece. The one on the right is where a wall has been constructed. This is an anti-tank wall. It's constructed on the beach and camouflaged from the seaside, as opposed to the beach side, by conforming to the sand dunes, or the contours of the sand dunes. And of course, over the last 50 years, the sand dunes have moved into different configurations. You're left with this wall, which reflects a period of time very accurately, but is completely at odds with it now in its own environment. Next. Similarly, I'm doing a project in Portugal now, and the factory where I'm working, round the back of it, somebody built this wall, which struck me from a distance, and it became like a void. It was very, very white. I mean, where it met this rather rocky landscape, whoever painted the wall actually built the wall and painted it extremely accurately. So where the wall touched the stone, no matter how small, the stone would be cut in half, and the painted wall would actually correspond exactly with that bit. A plant would be left in place, because this was literally the day it was painted. So you had a very peculiar sensation of space disappearing, a void, and these rocks which had been actually cut in half. Similarly, I think that's an East London Road building, I'm not sure, a house. I think it was one of the master's houses, the Bauhaus. But I thought in relation to that the thing that becomes animated there is the reflection in the windows, and the wall itself starts to become, again, like a void. So instead of being aware of the volume, you're aware of this sort of almost two-dimensional images through the windows, the reflection in the windows. Next. And at this time, in the late 70s, I was doing some work which was very minimal in the sense I had very limited means. I'd left Belfast and was back in London, And this piece was taking the notion of a singular action and making a cut in one length of timber, which is imperial, is 4 inches by 1 inch. And I made a series of arc cuts, and then put them together to define this square within a circle. Similarly on the right, again in Portugal, these windows, which had lost their purpose as windows and been blocked up on the inside, but they also had a change of scale and a change of form, because they were circular on the outside and they changed through a chamfer to square on the inside. Next, please. This was a piece which I showed in Paris at the same time, around about 1980. And it was the other side of those very lightweight wooden pieces. This was 30mm steel plate, and it went through a series of configurations. The purpose of them was that it was very, very heavy. Each one of these plates, which are triangular profile cut with 1 meter on the longest edge, were put through a series of patterns and shapes that moved. There's only one animation, which I hope is on the video next. Sorry, can I do the video? Oh, this is a piece in Dublin. It's just another one of the sandworks. That was as close as I ever got to a performance. Carry on. No. Oh, well, that was it. That was a steel piece which unfolded itself and then folded itself back up again. Slides, please. Well, we're not going to buy one of those machines.
No, 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 you got one.
Next, please.
Absolutely.
The piece on the left is a piece I did in 1991 in Belfast. It was a gallery which was actually part of the art school, at least in the bottom part of the art school, and it was a building which I was used to at my youth being the co-op bookstore, but it turned into this gallery space. And it's unusual insofar as it was like most shop front galleries tend to have one window and then go back a long way. This had 3 windows and went along the road, so there was a very close relationship between the road and the outside. If I'll just read about 2 minutes of a short text in relation to this piece. Sometimes I've been interested in how architectural form functions in an anthropomorphic way. A door becomes a mouth, windows become eyes. These analogies can extend to the whole body, but throughout history, many cultures have made direct connections between architectural features and human form. The relatively recent structures built for surveillance purposes in Northern Ireland take this analogy to often observe extremes. The towers and observation posts becoming all-seeing eyes, dominating and controlling both rural and urban landscapes. They have replaced the mythical giants of local folklore and legend. The armoured windows and observations stare without emotion. It is not possible to see a human presence behind the thick glass screens. The structures themselves become humanoid, brutal but also comic, like huge players in a bizarre ritual, moving and reforming themselves as strategic or social circumstances change and develop. Ordinary materials available from the local builder's merchant take on new sinister connotations, intrusive and obstructive, yet familiar. When they began to appear some 20 years ago, structures were designed to look as if they could be removed immediately, should the political or military situation allow it. However, through time they have gradually become more and more permanent. And Instead of sandbag and corrugated iron screens, new buildings are constructed with reinforced concrete bunkers with an added facade of stone or a thin skin of brick. The hand-built quality of early bunkers from the 1970s, for all their brutality and ugliness, were nevertheless expressive and personal in their ad hoc use of diverse materials. They successfully reflected the sadness and confusion of the political and military situation. They aged quickly and reflected time. The new structures of the 1990s, with their more socially acceptable urban aesthetic, are about place, an acceptable place, saving place, and the expressionless place of resignation to long-term commitment. The work I exhibited at the Orpheus Gallery takes account of the unusual nature of the space it occupies. The gallery is dominated by three large plate glass windows which reveal a long, narrow interior parallel to the street outside. It is as easy to look into the gallery as it is to look out at the street beyond. The sculpture about face is a large single object, constructed out of heavy steel sections bolted together to form panels, which have multi-layers of wire-reinforced glass set into them, in such a way as to allude to a stylized two-sided face. The object dominates the space it occupies, but also looks at the world outside. It returns the stare. The ambiguity of the work functions in disturbing and benign ways. It questions our perception of structures we have grown to accept as a part of everyday life in Northern Ireland. The other thing that it did, which was most important, was it is a very inanimate object. Next slide, please. It weighed about a metric ton, and it was balanced on a very thin edge, but nevertheless it looked, in one sense, slightly precarious, but at the same time it was very heavily rooted. And it was an expressionless stare. One didn't know whether it was a smiling face or a frowning face or a scowl, but what it did was it reflected this animation of the passing scene outside. So there was a constantly changing patterns of light. There was a wire effect of these multi-layers of Georgian glass. And as it reflected the passing of time with the sunsets, the sun and the rising sunset, but it also reflected the pretty street outside. Next, please. I've done my half hour. Well, a couple of minutes more. All right, I'll do one more piece. And next on the right. These are some drawings which I traced in from a book in Rome, done by Francesco di Giorgio Martini, who was a 15th century Italian architect. And the thing that struck me about them was that in many cases they were like city plans and plans of fortifications, but some of them started to look very much like clay skins of animals. Next, please. Another drawing by Francesco di Giorgio of this idealized town, with the castle of the seat of temple town, the church in the heart, and the seat of the ecclesiastical town, the outset of the stomach, and the tower defining the figure. The slide on the left is a drawing I did for an installation which I was going to do in Glasgow in '82, and it was about defining the figure over a period of time by building some low walls of sand. It also reflected a vulnerable, kind of like first son before, it reflected a sort of vulnerability of this child of often getting rapidly changed in that position, but a very dominant child he was. And this column was part of the architectural structure of the gallery, held the roof up, so it seemed appropriate to utilize it in this piece. Next slide. I began to construct this figure in real time again. The exhibition was open. The only thing that was on the wall was that Francesco di Giorgio drawing. And I began at the column and built these two sand walls, one 100 millimeters square, and the other 200 by 100 millimeters square. They were very small, very fragile, and as the figure developed over the period of the week and people began to realize it wasn't real, the form prescribed itself by these drawn lines, but it also began to exclude people from the space. So although they were very fragile and very small, as the figure became defined, the space actually got closed down, and the space actually ended up being very inactive as opposed to active. So I was making the work, but the more I made of the work, the less intervention was possible from the audience. They didn't come in, they looked through this door, and this foot, in fact, the right-hand foot, extended slightly to the next gallery, so there was even a slight threatening nature to that. Next slide, please. And next on the left, this was the whole piece. So it filled the gallery and dominated it. And I'll rush through these very quick. It's a sort of tangential, but that figure and several other works I did subsequently reflected my son growing up. In fact, so by moving two of these limbs around, this figure became animated into a slightly kneeling figure, then a running figure. Next on the left. So by moving two of the limbs around and putting it in perspective, it became that. By making it in real space, 4 meters by 2, it became that. Next slide. This is a piece of the Hayward in '83, which was to do with creating sort of formal circular motion through indicators. Next. And that moved on to another piece I did in Rome, and next on the left as well, which I don't have a slide of. It was a very large installation at an old church in Rome. And these two little figures were on the wall. They're very small. And it's the same figure as the last time, but made out of lead, scrunched up, articulated, and then filled in on the other side by plaster. They're both bronze, these very so big. And there's lots of other work, but I'm not going to show it. So that will do. Oh, thank you very much, John.
Some attention to this slide he was talking this morning. So thanks for coming.